So I only found out recently that there is going to be a new series which ties into the Hannibal Lecter movies. It's a TV show called Clarice, which is pretty self-explanatory. It follows Clarice after the events of Silence of the Lambs. Apparently they can't reference Hannibal in them, which seems really odd and seems like kind of destined to fail, this show, but don't judge a book by its cover. But anyways, now is the perfect time to rank and review all of the Hannibal movies. I only thought there was 4 movies, but it turns out there's 5, so I've watched through them all in the past month or two in preparation for this video. So if you're not aware, Hannibal Lecter is one of the most iconic film villains, like psychopaths, ever to be put on screen. And the character was made most famous from Silence of the Lambs, but apparently there's also a movie that came before it called Manhunter, as well as other movies after Silence of the Lambs called Hannibal, Red Dragon, and then Hannibal Rising. Yeah, so I've had to watch through all of them recently for this video. And without further ado, let's get into my ranking of all the Hannibal Lecter movies. Easily coming in at 5th and last place, we have the most recent movie, Hannibal Rising. Now, the way these movies were made, they weren't made in chronological order at all. You know, I'll talk about them more as we go through, but this was essentially a Hannibal Lecter origin story, and it was awful. I know all these movies are based off books, I've literally got them downstairs, but this movie just contains so many things which I wouldn't associate with Hannibal Lecter nowadays. You know, some of the things they're like, oh, this is what put him on course to do certain things, but they don't seem like they're part of his character when they do it in this movie. There are some flashes of Hannibal's characteristics in there which we see later on, but nothing that really resembles what you'd say is the finished product of the character. It was actually so much different in terms of tone, the way it was shot, and just the character itself, that I actually had to keep looking to make sure that this was the right film I was watching and it wasn't a completely different movie. That's how different it felt. And in this case, different isn't good. Unless you had read the books, Hannibal's backstory was somewhat of a mystery to us. And as we can see, he's this really messed up guy. Some of us like that mystery, you know, you could make of it what you'd want. But here, now that we've seen what actually happens, I'm not going to say it dampens the character, but when you look at him, you certainly, now that you know his origin story, you can either ignore it because it feels so different, or you don't really look at him the same way. You know, it could have just been the way it's written, or maybe it was the performance from Gaspard Ulliel. I'm pretty sure I mispronounced that, but we move. I found his performance really, really poor and out of touch with what Hopkins has done and what Cox had done. And overall, I don't know, it felt way too long. It drags in so many different areas of this movie. And they also include these slow motion shots of like flashbacks which look really outdated, and this movie was only like 14 years ago. Even on paper, this movie seemed like it wouldn't be great, so I tried going in with an open mind, but it was even worse than what I thought it would have been. So my final score for Hannibal Rising is 46%, and just to confirm, that comes in at last and 5th place. This was a tough one, but coming in at 4th place, I have Hannibal. This is the second movie starring Anthony Hopkins as the title character. This one is based after Silence of the Lambs, where it takes place, and in that movie we had heard all these stories about Hannibal, and he didn't get released until the end, but now here he has all the freedom to roam for the first time we've seen, not including Hannibal Rising, as I distanced that one very much from these movies. But we get to see him in his full psycho mode, demonstrating some of the things we had heard about, not disappointing us at all in that department. I'm somebody who can handle a lot of gore in movies and doesn't really get grossed out. In fact, the only really weakness I show when I'm watching a movie is when an animal's being harmed, but here it really nails the grossness with some things. It really made me uncomfortable, especially towards the end. It's very gory, and some of the stuff that does happen is really uncomfortable to watch. However, the movie overall, its quality has decreased massively, including in the character Clarice Starling, who has been recast here. Jodie Foster did such a great job with the first one, but here Julianne Moore just can't match the same feel of the character, so I didn't really buy her as Clarice. Maybe if they just brought a different FBI agent in with Julianne Moore playing her, maybe it would have been better, but here I just couldn't buy it. I don't really know the story behind why Jodie Foster didn't come back. I don't know if it's just the bigger budget or Hannibal being out in the open, but this just really did not feel like a sequel that much. As I mentioned, Clarice was recast, so maybe that's why, but the only real connection I feel with it is Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal. Other than that, it feels really different. It does sway into some cartoonish ways, especially with Gary Oldman's character. That's maybe partially why it doesn't feel as similar, because it's silly in some ways, and overall it just feels too long. The first movie I'll talk about in a bit, but that went by really fast. This one just dragged in many different ways. And I mentioned there are some gross factors here, that's fair enough, but the main genre of this movie and the previous one is thriller. It technically does have horror involved, but you know, it's none of that stuff. It's just like the thriller stuff which will creep you out. But here, they try too hard to make it a horror. Like, they do jump scares, which you didn't really get in the other ones, which really do feel out of place, but nonetheless, a massive improvement on Hannibal Rising. And just to confirm, I gave Hannibal a 65%, and it finished in 4th place. Coming in at 3rd place, I have Manhunter. This is the one that I didn't realise was a Hannibal movie until I actually looked into it. This came before Silence of the Lambs, and it doesn't really have any of those cast members. I believe there is one person who remains the same casted in all these movies except Hannibal Rising, so that's pretty cool. I feel like my review for this one might annoy a lot of the die-hard fans of this movie. What I can say about it though is the overall plot with the serial killer, the Tooth Fairy, is really interesting and really creepy, especially the way he displays his victims after killing them. As this was like an early 80s movie, I can appreciate the excitement around it at that time and how much of a new thing it was, as there wasn't too much excitement from that genre up until then, but nowadays I just feel like I've seen this kind of formula and I've seen it done much better in a much more enjoyable way, because overall I found this to be quite a boring movie, and that's going to annoy a lot of people because they say it's really underrated. It's tough because I wanted to share those same views as those people, but I frankly couldn't force myself to see the same way as you guys do. I'll be honest, this movie hasn't aged fantastically as much as Silence of the Lambs has. I know I've compared every movie in this list so far to that movie, but we'll talk about that in a bit. It drags a lot, if I'm gonna be honest. There's a much better telling of the story in a movie which we'll get onto in a minute, and I don't know what the difference is between those two, if it's just, you know, the time period, the times these films were made. This one hasn't, as I said, didn't age particularly well, and it feels really low budget compared to that movie which we'll get onto in a minute. You know, it had actually good reviews, and looking into those reviews, people say it's a really underrated thriller, but unfortunately, I couldn't share those same views. In terms of rating for Manhunter, I gave it a 66%. And yeah, just to confirm, that comes in at 3rd place. Coming in at 2nd place is Red Dragon. Now, as I was talking about Manhunter just then, Red Dragon is the same telling of the same story. The book itself is actually called Red Dragon, but Manhunter was the name for the movie which was based off of it. This one, it tells the same story, but I believe it does it in a better and more interesting way. This is where it got a bit confusing for me at first, but then I slowly realised, but although this is Hopkins' last movie as Hannibal, this takes place before the other two, so I had to work that out for myself. But all those kind of cartoonish elements I said were in Hannibal, the movie, they're gone here. It's back down to a more serious tone. It doesn't reach the heights of a movie which we'll get onto in a minute, which I know it's obvious what one's gonna be, but just in case, someone might be shocked. But even though there was some, things you wouldn't normally see in a movie, I liked how it felt a bit more realistic once again and more grounded. I mentioned this was Hopkins' last movie as Hannibal, and as it took place before Silence of the Lambs, he is still in a cell, so he's just like in the original. It forms that partnership again from behind bars with the agent who's trying to solve a killer. I actually enjoyed the amount of screen time Hannibal had in this movie, as they can't just force him in it if he's not going to do much from behind bars, as his stuff is quite restricted. So he was sprinkled in a nice amount there. But in the lead we have Edward Norton, who I really like as an actor, and I thought did a great job here. He was much more enjoyable than the guy who played the same character in Manhunter. I think his name was Will Peterson, I don't remember exactly. He kind of fills that same role as Jodie Foster as Clarice had, but does it in a really different way. Obviously they're not playing the same character, but their role, hunting down this person, pretty much with them predominantly in the lead, getting help from Hannibal, who is within his cell. So that stuff, it was just a nice dynamic, to switch it up. Their characters themselves, they weren't identical. They had enough difference for you to remember what happened in what movie. However, I say that, but there are a lot of things in this movie which do copy Silence of the Lambs, the way the formula's written out. I know I just mentioned I liked the Hannibal and Will Graham dynamic just like the Hannibal and Clarice one, but when that sort of stuff also happened, it made the rest of the movie predictable. As you could realise, it was kind of following the same formula as Silence of the Lambs and hoping for the same success. I thought this movie was good, not near the level as that, but still very good, very enjoyable, especially for a thriller or horror movie, I guess you could say. And in terms of rating, I gave Red Dragon a 72%. And just to confirm, that was a runner-up, meaning it's coming in second. And I guess you can guess what is about to come in at first place. Which of course means coming in at first place is The Silence of the Lambs. I can guarantee coming into this, with any knowledge of these movies, you knew this one was going to be in first place. One of the easiest winners by far in one of my rankings. Straight from the start they established this underdog. I can't exactly pinpoint what about it, but we want her to succeed instantly. I don't know if it's just because she's looked over because she's a girl in the FBI at that time and everyone's doubting her, but we instantly want her to do well. And it's also extra handy to want to root for a character if they're played by Jodie Foster, who here does one of her best jobs ever. Because there's so much suspense and intrigue in this movie, rewatching it, I only noticed how great the camera work is and the way it's shot. There's so many of those long takes which make the conversation feel really free and flowing, like you're there in the moment. And then I realised that's partially one of the reasons why it's so suspenseful. Movies, especially at that time, tended to take quite long in shots, and in a lot of them it kind of drags, but here it feels agonizing. Anthony Hopkins was phenomenal as Hannibal Lecter. This is one of the best performances I've seen for a character which is like this. I believe it's actually on par with Heath Ledger. Heath Ledger gets to show a bit more craziness, but Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter, he's actually a polite guy, which is why it's so creepy. Also to the fact that he barely blinks when he's speaking. He's looking into you with those soulless eyes. It just sends shivers down your spine because it's genuinely creepy. I mentioned he comes across as a genuinely polite guy, so it's really shocking when he's, talking about normal things and then without changing the tone of his voice, keeping on that calm tone, he just talks about how he ate someone's liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti. It's some really creepy stuff. At first you're like, surely this can't be the right guy, but then you realise, yep, he's just not what you'd expect. Many movies have tried to replicate that same feeling, but nothing has really felt the same as Anthony Hopkins in this movie. And it really does say something about his performance and the reputation he establishes when, for the majority of the movie, this character is in a cell and all you hear are these stories sprinkled out. Obviously you see what happens. It's just insane what things can be done from just him being locked up, the kind of message it sends to yourself and the impression it gives off. And because it's so well done, you actually do care about the character. You want Clarice to win obviously, but then you want Hannibal to succeed as well, and at the end of the day, both of them get their victories, and that's kind of what plays into making this movie so interesting. We've seen, your generic manhunt plot before, and this is kind of what happens here as well. It's quite a generic plot, but they mix it up by having, the main villain, Buffalo Bill, who is extremely creepy, and then they have maybe the more dangerous villain, Hannibal Lecter, who's locked up, and they get help off Hannibal Lecter, the villain. So stuff like that was very interesting. You didn't see it around that time, and to be honest, you don't see it too much this time. Obviously you see movies where they team up with the villain, which kind of, it's really forced sometimes, but here it just genuinely feels so real, which is why this movie is so brilliant and so creepy. In terms of rating for The Silence of the Lambs, I had to give it an 86%, and it's easily coming in at first place. So there is my ranking of the 5 Hannibal Lecter movies, made in preparation because there's a new TV show coming out called Clarice, which I should be releasing this on the day of its first episode release. Let me know in the comments what your ranking would be, and if you've seen all of them. I'm quickly going to go over my ranking again and have it up on screen side by side so you can kind of compare the ratings. So just to recap, easily in last place. In 5th place I had Hannibal Rising with 46%. In 4th place I had Hannibal with 65%. And just narrowly above I had Manhunter in 3rd place with 66%. A bit of a jump upwards in 2nd place I had Red Dragon with 72%. And easily cementing 1st place, which I didn't think would be moved at all, was Silence of the Lamb with 86%. So yeah, there's my ranking. Let me know what yours is, and I really hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope to see you in my next one.